Imagine it. The year is 1849. The most recent administration had been one of the most successful in history when you think about what was promised and what actually got done. And for some reason, Polk made a promise to not run for a second term. And true to his promise, he didn't, citing that he accomplished all he wanted to, which was probably for the best, given the fact that a mere 3 months after leaving office, Polk passed away. Polk left the office on a high note for the Whigs, so it was probably a surprise to no one when a Whig, Zachary Taylor, won the presidential election of 1848. That means we have a new vice president. It was actually a surprise that Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore would make a presidential pair. Many expected the long-standing Henry Clay and Daniel Webster to make the nomination. However, many of the Whigs actually backed Taylor, who was a war hero. Funny enough, the first time that Zachary Taylor ever voted in a presidential election was for himself in his 60s. While those who picked Taylor really supported their choice, they still knew it would be a hard sell for those who were against slavery, as Taylor was a slave owner. So one of the party leaders, Thurlow Weed, decided that he actually had his own pick for vice presidency, and that was William Seward, who was his protege. Knowing that Fillmore was a contender for vice presidency, Weed had Fillmore support his pick of Seward. But what Weed hadn't considered was that Seward actually had enemies, and enough enemies to keep them from wanting to have him as vice president. So instead, they decided they needed a Whig candidate that would keep anti-slavery candidates from voting for someone else. So Millard Fillmore was chosen. Before being nominated for vice presidency, Willard Fillmore was the comptroller for New York, an elected position. And throughout the election, instead of making speech and going on the road, he continued working as a comptroller in New York because at the time it was seen as inappropriate for someone who was running for a higher office to give the appearance that they wanted that high office. Perhaps all that extra effort in his home state is what helped the Taylor-Fillmore ticket succeed, because they just barely beat out the Democratic candidate because of the electoral votes from New York. During the time between the election and Fillmore taking office, he continued to work in the comptroller's office in New York. And during this time, Zachary Taylor started a correspondence with his future vice president, and in it, he promised him a great deal of influence in his administration. For some reason, the president-elect believed that Fillmore was actually part of his cabinet, which wasn't the case. What Fillmore didn't know was that Weed and Seward were meeting up behind his back and discussing how they would divide and conquer once March came around. In a twist of irony, Millard Fillmore actually is the one who swore in Seward as he had been elected to the New York legislature. The alliance between Seward and Weed left Vice President Millard Fillmore with a lot less influence than he was promised. So he decided to take it up with his boss, which wasn't a good idea because then Taylor went and started blabbing it to everyone. So now it was a public, awkward situation. To make it even more awkward, there were a lot of people coming up to Fillmore asking for appointments, position appointments, and among other things, and he was basically there with his hands tied, like, because everyone that he wanted was getting overpowered by Weed or Seward. Perhaps the biggest joy that Millard Fillmore found in his vice presidency was his association with the Smithsonian Institute, in which he was a Board of Regents member. The biggest part of Fillmore's job was yet to come, though. While Weed continued fighting a war with him over influence, the reality is Fillmore reigned over the Senate. This was a really interesting time to having debates because President Taylor was in support of California and New Mexico becoming states. And Southerners were really shocked by this because everyone knew that those states would be admitted as free states. At the end of January in 1950, Henry Clay introduced an omnibus bill which gave concessions to both the North and the South. On one hand, California would be admitted as a state and it would be free. But then the Utah and New Mexico territories would remain territories. And then Texas and New Mexico would have an agreement on boundaries. Henry Clay also had in this bill that those two states would get to decide whether or not they had slaves. Also included in the act was a toughening up of the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, which many Northerners kind of looked the other way when it came to it. The president wasn't very excited about this bill, and after weeks and weeks of it going back and forth, Fillmore came to him and said, look, if it doesn't go one way or the other and I have to make the tie-breaking vote, I'm going to vote in favor of the bill. Despite the vice president's best efforts to keep things civil, he was accused of not doing his job when a fight broke out on the Senate floor. And this wasn't just a normal fist fight. The senator from Mississippi pulled out a gun. Luckily, the situation was calmed down before anyone got hurt, but that was just enough excitement for one vice presidency. 2.5 months later, Millard Fillmore's tenure as vice president came to an end following the passing of President Taylor after a cherry, milk, and ice debacle. And that's how Millard Fillmore became president. For more information on Millard Fillmore as president or Zachary Taylor's presidency, please check out the episodes on their tenure.